Museum of Art. Thank you for being here for our lecture today on plein air painting. And a couple of things before we get started. If you are a Randolph College student attending and hoping for a passport program credit, we started a list on the desk there in the entryway. You just sign up because we didn't have someone checking in for the passport program today. So, lecture today, we have a reception in Gallery 2. It was supposed to feature light refreshments, but I hear they're pretty substantial, so you can make out a meal today after this. So please don't forget about that. Sometimes people are in and out and they don't realize the spread that we have in Gallery 2. So. It's my pleasure to introduce today Kathleen Placidi. She's an art historian, a local art historian with a master's degree in art history from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. She carried out additional graduate study at the doctoral level in the field of American art at the University of Virginia. She has taught art history courses at the University of Virginia, James Madison University, Sweetbriar College, and Randolph College, and Randolph Women's College, on topics ranging from Asian art to 18th and 19th century American and European art to modern and contemporary art. In addition to teaching in a classroom setting, she is interested in how museums research and interpret their collections to the public. She has worked as an historic interpreter and in the curatorial department at Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, and has given public talks at a number of museums, including the Maier Museum of Art, where she has recently been involved in docent training. Kathleen is also an experienced fundraiser who has worked as a development officer at her alma mater, Case Western Reserve University, at Monticello and at Sweetbriar College, where she currently serves as the grants officer, helping raise funds for faculty research and college-wide initiatives. And today's lecture is sort of in preparation for events that will happen next weekend. It's in celebration of the second annual Paint Out Lynchburg event, held April 28th through 30th. Artists from across Virginia and surrounding states will gather in Lynchburg for 3 days to paint historic landmarks, cityscapes, and scenery. On Sunday, April 30th, the Mayor and Randolph College are co-hosting the Quick Draw competition. Artists have 2 hours to complete a painting of campus or the historic Rivermont district. The public is invited to come watch the artists at work. So please join me in welcoming Kathleen Placidi.
Thanks very much for coming out. First, let me thank Martha for that introduction and for inviting me to give this talk. And I also want to thank Laura McManus, the Curator of Education here at the Mayor, for inviting me to give this talk as well. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here this weekend, and the rest of the Mayor's staff. So today I'm going to be talking about plein air painting, and Martha and I were joking before we started that maybe given the weather today it's not the best day to go out and paint on plein air, but I know some of you are artists that I see before me. Actually, how many of you in the audience are painters? Oh, don't be shy. Oh golly, there's a whole bunch of you, very good. And how many of you paint on plein air, at least sometimes? Oh, okay. Well, there are a number of you. Very good. So, today, I will be talking about plein air painting in late 19th century American art. And I'm primarily going to focus on those artists that are represented in the Mayor's collection who were actually part of the plein air painting movement. And what you're seeing here in this first set of images are actually 3 that were painted on plein air. The Twachtman on the left, a Chase on top, and then Theodore Robinson on the bottom end. But I'll primarily be spending time talking about these 5 artists Cassatt, Haslam, Chase, Robinson, and Bachman, all of whom made very important contributions to plein air painting. Well, what is plein air painting? It's painting done out of doors. And the term is French. En plein air means to paint in the open air. Plein literally meaning full, so painting in the full or the open air. And while the term could be used really to describe any artwork that was done in the open air, it's generally used to refer to oil paintings created out of doors. Now, as you probably know, in the second half of the 19th century, plein air painting is most closely associated with a group of avant-garde artists who were working in France, who, frustrated by the conservatism of the art establishment, banded together to start showing their work independently of the government-sponsored annual salon exhibitions. And these painters come to be known as the Impressionists. Now, initially, this was a term given to them derogatorily by critics who thought their works were just impressions or sketches. But many of the artists ended up embracing the term and using it as a rallying cry for themselves. Now you see here, classic works by Renoir, Monet, and the Impressionists were dedicated to painting scenes of modern life, the urban scene, as in the Boulevard du Capuchin, scenes of the theater, as in La Loge, scenes of people out at leisure, like the outdoor café shown in Renoir's Ball at the Moulin de la Galette, or people out in leisure in the countryside, as in this work by Berthe Morisot. In addition to their commitment to modern life, the Impressionists really painted in what was then a very radical method. They all painted directly on the canvases. They did not use underpainting. They used pure pigment. They did not blend tones or use half-tones. So they didn't use modeling or shading. They basically used each brush stroke as a building block of color. They tended to have a very bright palette in their works, and they were very aware of new theories of color and optics. They knew that light was made up of color and that even shadows weren't black. They themselves were made of color. So in a pure Impressionist work, you really don't see black used that much in the painter's palettes at all. And with their interests in light and color, in painting quickly, and in using innovative painting methods, it's not surprising that the Impressionists all painted en plein air at times as it suited their artistic means and their subject matter. And Claude Monet, in particular, was dedicated to painting en plein air. Now, at this time, exhibiting a work that had been painted in the open air was considered very radical. And so exhibiting works like these was part of the Impressionist Declaration of Independence from the establishment. So plein air painting is very new, and yet the Impressionists were not actually the very first painters to paint en plein air, embrace the method, and then try to exhibit works formally that had been painted this way. It was actually a previous generation that started the plein air movement going in France. The plein air painters, in that generation were basically led by Camille Corot. And he was seen as the spiritual leader of a group of plein air painters who largely painted landscapes outside the village of Barbizon, which was located in the forest of Fontainebleau, just outside Paris. Among these pioneers were Theodore Rousseau, and not a member of the Barbizon school, but the painter Eugène Baudin began painting beach scenes at Trouville on the Normandy coast in the 1850s. And so these first users of plein air painting were all big influences on the artists that we call the Impressionists. But you may wonder, well, why was it at this time, in the mid-19th century, and then preceding, and then following, that plein air painting really catches on? Partly, this was because of a change in aesthetics, the interest in a painting that looked less formal and was painted in a less formal way. But, and this is very important, the plein air revolution owed quite a lot to commercial advances in oil paints, which really made plein air painting possible. The paint tube, which any of you who paint probably use, you're all familiar with it. But the paint tube was not invented until 1841. It was invented by an American artist named John Rand, who was working in London, and his invention was quickly commercialized. And this enabled artists to buy ready-made paints in collapsible tubes that had screw-on cap lids, which meant you could squeeze out on your palette what you wanted to use. You did not have to mix your own paints anymore, which had been quite arduous. And because of advances in 19th century chemistry, there were many more colors available now than there had ever been before. And before the invention of the paint tube, when you mixed up your own paints by grinding pigment and mixing the pigment with an oil binder, you had to store them in things like bladders made of pig's bladder, and you tie them up with twine, or you could use a little glass jar like this. But the problem was, before the heyday of the paint tube, the paints would dry out so quickly that when you were making your own paint, you really couldn't make too much at a time. When you wanted to use your pig's bladder paint, for example, you'd have to puncture a hole in it. So then you couldn't really seal it up again. And if you think about it, you really couldn't transport these containers very easily. But with the paint tube, you throw your paints and your easel in a satchel, you grab your folding easel, and you are ready to go and paint on plein air. So it really was this technical revolution that helped make this possible. Now, when we cross the Atlantic and start looking at some American art, as we know, the Maier Museum has a really superb collection of landscape paintings, and many of them are by painters of the Hudson River School. And since landscape painting takes place or shows us scenes from the outdoors, it seems a topic ideally suited for plein air painting. But artists in the United States didn't immediately embrace the plein air method. So about the same time the Barbizon painters in France are painting out in the open air in the forest of Fontainebleau, the Hudson River School painters like Cole and Durand, who are painting works of scenic American wonders that are meant to show the world what kinds of wonderful scenery America had, and the works are also meant to inspire patriotism. They're not painting on plein air. Even after oil paints become readily available in tubes, painters from Cole to Durand to Kensett and Moran, to speak of the Hudson River School painters in this museum, they don't really paint in the open air. Their finished landscapes are produced in the studio based on sketches that are done in nature. So going out in nature is very important to them. They just don't do finished oil paintings there. And here, for example, oh, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. This sketch by Cole, Chicora Peak, which was the old name for Carway Peak. So he did this in 1828. It's actually a pencil sketch, which later in the studio he inked over, probably to help preserve it. It has very detailed notes, and he always did this to his sketches. He would notate them about atmospheric conditions, colors that he was observing, etc. But it's interesting that sometimes Cole would mine a sketch years later, because if you notice the date, he painted Corway Peak in 1844, and you can see it's obviously based on this sketch, but that was done 16 years earlier. Now, Asher B. Durand was also a very powerful advocate for the artist to go out into nature, to learn from nature, for nature to be the artist's teacher, and also to gain spiritual refreshment from nature. And indeed, in this pond in this painting, you see the sketcher out in nature. Now, Durand did actually paint plein air oil sketches in addition to doing pencil and watercolor sketches. And his plein air sketches, and this is a good example of them, they're really very beautiful. They're very detailed, they're just gorgeous works. Except Durand never exhibited these works. He never considered them finished. To him, the finished work was the one done in the studio. Now, in terms of artists who actually did paint on plein air and considered these finished works to exhibit, Mary Cassatt is one of the prime examples. And this is a sort of sampling of her work, including the pastel sketch that the mayor owns. Cassatt was one of the first American artists to embrace plein air painting and exhibit works painted in the open air. And this isn't surprising, considering that she was an extremely avant-garde artist who created brilliant work in many media, and she was a member of the Impressionist Group in Paris. Cassatt was an American expatriate. She was from a well-to-do Pennsylvania family. She first trained in the United States, but then studied in Paris and stayed there. Members of her family, her father, mother, and her older sister Lydia, lived with her in Paris. And Cassatt had some early success exhibiting her works in the salon, but she wanted to be free of establishment practices and limitations. She wanted to be a member of the avant-garde, and her work attracted the attention of the Impressionist groups. Edgar Degas became her good friend and invited her to exhibit with the Impressionists. So she first began exhibiting with them in the fourth group Impressionist show, which took place in 1879. And over a period from 1874 to 1886, the Impressionists actually had 8 group shows, and Cassatt was part of 4 of them. And like her fellow Impressionists, she painted scenes of modern life. So you see people at home, people in the theater, people at leisure and gardens. But like her fellow Impressionist Berthe Morisot, the other very important woman painter in the group, Cassatt tended to concentrate on women and children as her subject matter. She often used the women in her family as models, and Morisot did this too. And in part, her subject matter and her use of models was really constricted by her gender and by her status as an upper-class woman. And Cassatt was actually more interested in painting indoor subject matter than in painting in the open air, and she also liked the control of a studio. But she did create a number of open-air works, and these are 3 of them, which you see as an example. And Cassatt's work is always very interested in structure. She always has a very strong sense of design in her works. And so in her plein air painting, you still see that strong structure. In other words, her works don't dissolve or break down in light the way you see happening to work of Monet often. And all of these works show you Cassatt's characteristics. She uses a very bright palette. She paints directly on the canvas. Each brush stroke is a building block of color. Her canvases are very flat, they're very decorative. She crops compositions, and they have rapidly up-tilting perspectives. And the cropping, the perspectives are from the influence of Japanese art, which Cassatt studied and collected. Now, in the summer of 1880, Cassatt and her family wanted to get out of the heat of Paris, which lots of Parisians would do if they could afford it. And they rented a country house that summer at a little place called Marly-le-Roi, which is about 10 miles outside Paris. The house had a walled garden. So that was very nice for the family because then they could be outside and yet have privacy. And it was great for Cassatt's wanting to do more plein air painting because it meant she could paint in the walled garden with privacy rather than making a spectacle of herself by painting out on the public street. This is Cassatt's older sister Lydia. So she's crocheting a piece of lace. She's very fashionably dressed. She's also protected from the sun with her beautiful lacy hat and her little fingerless mitts. And you can see that Cassatt is very interested in the play of light on Lydia's garments and on the plants in the garden. Sadly, Lydia died only 2 years after this was painted. She died of kidney disease. And Cassatt and her mother took the loss of Lydia very hard. They both suffered health setbacks in their period of grief. So in the summer of 1884, Cassatt and her mother, in part to recover their health, went on a seaside vacation in Spain. And that's where Cassatt painted this work, children playing on the beach. The little girls we might imagine are sisters. They're very close. And I always think it's poignant that one of the little girls has her face turned away from us and covered by a hat. And I can't help but wonder if that's a reference to the loss of Lydia. And we know that Cassatt painted this en plein air, so she just set up her easel right on the beach. But we also know that she continued to work on it back home in the studio, but nonetheless it retains that sense of freshness and bright sunshine. And it's interesting too that in Cassatt's oeuvre, this is the only beach scene that she ever did, so it's important for that reason too. Another very well-known work of Cassatt's, The Boating Party, was also painted en plein air, and this was done on the French Riviera in the winter of 1893-94. This was just after Cassatt's father had passed away. So she and her mother rented a home in Cap d'Antibes, and the owner of the home had a boat that he kept in the back for tenants to be able to use, and the house was right on the water. So Cassatt hired local models and posed them in the boat, and presumably she painted it while the boat was beached, rather than, actually going out in the water herself. And it's interesting because in this work you can see that Cassatt is really interested in bold, abstract shapes. There's severe cropping here, really rapid, up-tilted perspective. Even the back of the man's form is really very abstracted with all that dark blue-black cloth. This work is interesting too in that it does feature a man prominently in the composition, because Cassatt really didn't have men in her paintings much unless they were male members of her family. Now, plein air painting at this time then is very associated with the avant-garde in art. However, it is important to note that not all the leading 19th century American artists painted en plein air. To use some examples of artists in the Maier collection, Whistler did a number of landscape paintings. He tended to call them nocturnes. But he did not paint au plein air. He would sketch out in the open air, but he always did his completed works in the studio, and he would paint from memory. He put all his sketches away and did not refer to them because he liked the air of reverie and moodiness that he got from painting from memory. Similarly, George Inness did not paint finished oils en plein air. He would sketch out of doors, but as in the case with Whistler, literal depiction of the landscape he looked at was not his goal. Inness was really most interested in conveying through his art the spiritual and mystical links that he felt existed among all living beings. So sometimes he would paint in the studio based on sketches, but then often, particularly in later works, like Early Evening Montclair, he didn't use sketches at all and just painted from his imagination. Winslow Homer, one of the great American artists, in the 1860s and 1870s, painted a series of works that showed Americans engaged in outdoor activities, often leisure activities. In this case, the bridle path White Mountains. The White Mountains was a big tourist area, and people would go there to enjoy various activities, such as horseback riding that we see here. And Homer's works showing these open-air activities, whether they're resort activities or people out in the country or people hunting, they're just imbued with light and atmosphere. You can see he's very interested in the play of light on the rocks, on the hide of the horse, on the woman's form. except he did not paint these works on plein air. He did them in the studio based on sketches that he did on plein air, and this is one of the sketches that he used to create this work in the studio. And he certainly he certainly sketched these on site, and this one he actually dated August 24, 1868, White Mountains. But it shows that you can't always tell by looking, in other words, whether a painting was done in this period on plein air or not. Now, where Homer is a painter on plein air without parallel is as a watercolor artist. Homer's, in my opinion, the greatest watercolor painter of the 19th century, maybe of all time in American art. You can see in representative works like these that he's a brilliant colorist. He uses a lot of the white of the paper in his watercolors. He really uses the fluidity and the transparency of the watercolor medium in his works. He's very interested in light. Homer first started painting watercolors in the 1870s, and he tended to paint them in big groups while he was on vacations. So a work like the Adirondack Guide was painted when Homer was on a fishing vacation in the Adirondack Mountains. He was quite a sportsman, actually. Homer went to the Bahamas twice for the second time in the winter of 1898-99, which is when he painted this really wonderful work. You can just almost feel the water. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm not going to continue speaking about watercolors because I do want to concentrate again on artists who were doing en plein air at this time in oil. And one of these is William Merritt Chase. Now, as the Impressionists in France grew more accepted and successful, their work became better known in America. And there were very important exhibits of Impressionist painting held in New York City in the 1880s. And plein air painting then becomes very closely associated with the Impressionists and with avant-garde painting practices. And so a number of American artists in the late 19th century experiment with, and in some cases, wholeheartedly adopt the method of plein air painting. Now, Chase was an extremely versatile and innovative artist. He became a master of open air painting, and he became an important proponent of the method through his teaching. This particular landscape in the Maier's collection was probably painted at Shinnecock Hills, which is in Long Island. Chase had a summer house there, and as we'll see, he taught open air painting classes in the summers there for many years. Now, Chase had studied art in Germany at the Royal Academy in Munich. He returned to the United States in 1878 and very quickly established himself as one of the leading artists in New York. Now, by the 1880s, he began exhibiting paintings that he had done en plein air. And almost all of these works were painted in the great new public parks that had opened in the late 19th century, Prospect Park in Brooklyn and Central Park in Manhattan. So this is the Condon Central Park. And the whole impetus in developing these urban parks were to give the urban dwellers the benefits of fresh air, sunshine, and open air. So Chase is showing us very much scenes of middle and upper class leisure in these works. But you can see he's really working in full Impressionist mode. He's interested in sunlight and shadow. His palette is very light filled. You see the sun dappling on things. And his brushstroke has really changed a lot. He's using the Impressionist brushstroke where each stroke is really building up a block of color. In 1891, because of his reputation growing as a plein air painter and because of his importance as a teacher in various New York art schools, and Chase even founded his own school of art in New York, by the way, the Chase School of Art, he was approached by a group of well-to-do New Yorkers to direct a open-air painting school that was going to be based in Shinnecock Hills, which is a very sand-dune area in the town of Southampton on eastern Long Island. Now, Southampton was just a short train ride from New York City. So by the 1880s, a number of well-to-do New Yorkers were either renting or had built summer homes there. And in order to build up the area as a summer resort, several of these wealthy residents decided they needed to do things to help attract people to the area. Now, these residents happened to have ties to the real estate company and to the railroad company that served Long Island, but they were also philanthropists, and they started a number of institutions, including a tennis club, a golf course, and an open-air painting school. So from 1891 to 1902, Chase was director of the Shinnecock Summer School of Art. And he taught open-air painting to about 100 to 150 students each summer. The students were female, male, they were amateur and professional artists. They boarded in local cottages, and they devoted themselves to art. So in these two photographs, you see the students at work. And by the way, the majority of students in the school, year after year, were women. And Chase was very interested in teaching women students. Now here you actually see Chase himself demonstrating technique to some students. You can see he's very nattily dressed. He's painting in a suit and a straw boater. And Chase always dressed like a gentleman. He was always very natty. And he thought that that was what he should do as an artist, because art was a serious profession and he wanted people to know him. And here are students painting in the hills. Now the routine of the instruction was that on Mondays and Tuesdays, Chase actually taught. And the students called those Chase days. And on Monday morning, he would do a critique with the students of the work that they'd done the previous week. And then the rest of the week, the students were on their own to paint on plein air independently. And Chase himself spent those days working on his own art, producing paintings like these. And I'll let you read this quote of Chase's. It's really a nice distillation of his philosophy about plein air painting. So again, you can see in works like these, Chase is working in a full-blown Impressionist mode. Now, he did have a summer house at Shinnecock, and his family always went with him. And he tended, when he was doing his own paintings at Shinnecock, to paint in the areas right around the house and use his wife and children and their friends as models. So that's what we see here. And this is very much a scene of upper-class leisure. You can see that the women and children are wearing these very, frilly, lovely white lawn dresses, and they're sheltering from the sun with these really beautiful Japanese umbrellas. Chase was quite a collector of interesting artifacts. But sometimes when Chase painted the scenes around Shinnecock, he would do unpeopled landscapes, really focusing on the scrubby grass and the dunes and the hills beyond. But all of these works are just imbued with light and atmosphere. Now, Chase closed the school at Shinnecock in 1902, and without Chase, the school basically closed down. He closed the school because he wanted more time to devote to himself for painting in the summers, and he also didn't want to have to go to Shinnecock every summer. So he no longer necessarily goes to Shinnecock each summer from 1902 on. Also, Chase very rarely dated his paintings, so sometimes it can be tricky to figure out the chronology of his works. This painting in the Maier, you can see his very distinctive signature, no date, and this has been variously dated 1902 or 1907, though 1907 seems to be the date that we're using now, but it makes sense because Chase's later paintings of Shinnecock do tend to be unpeopled, like this deserted beach, which you can see that there are sailboats in the distance. Go take a look at this in the other room when we're done. It's just a beautiful work. It's very thinly painted too, so it's very It's very, very interesting. Now, this is the Maier's plein air painting by Theodore Robinson, The Valley of the Seine. Robinson spent much of his career in France and actually became a good friend and colleague of Claude Monet, and he painted in Giverny. Now, Robinson's life tragically was cut short by ill health. He suffered from chronic asthma and he was only 44 when he died. But before then, he helped introduce Impressionism and plein air painting to the United States, both through his own artworks and through his teaching of plein air methods. Robinson was from Vermont. He studied briefly at the National Academy of Design before going to Paris to study art in 1876. He came back to the United States, supported himself for several years by painting, tried to sell art. He also did some decorative design work. But he's back in Paris in 1884, and that's when he becomes interested in Impressionism and really goes whole hog for the Impressionist method and starts painting on plein air. He first met Claude Monet on a one-day visit in 1885, and he and an artist friend, a Frenchman, went to visit Monet at Giverny. Now, Monet had moved to Giverny in 1883, and this was a very small, rural, picturesque village on the River Seine, about 80 miles from Paris. And as you probably know, Monet designed an incredible garden for himself there, and much of his paintings from that point on are of the area around Giverny and of his garden, and he lived there for the rest of his life. Robinson went on 6 extended visits to Giverny. He went there annually from spring through fall, from 1887 through 1892. So here in 2 works from 1889 or thereabouts, you can see that he's painting in a full-blown Impressionist style. His work is imbued with light and atmosphere. He's using a broken Impressionist brushstroke. He often painted from the hills, looking down on the village, as you see here. And of course, you see it's very, very picturesque. Sometimes he just painted pure landscape. Sometimes he had figures in his landscapes, as here. And typically, he would ask villagers to pose for him. Though in this case, this rather well-dressed young woman is not one of the villagers of Giverny. She is a woman named Marie, who was Robinson's lover. Marie was the artist model who lived and worked in Paris, but she visited Robinson at Giverny a number of times. They may have had a daughter together. That's not clear, but there was gossip that when Marie visited, she would bring a very little girl with her. And she described this little girl as her niece, but most people thought it was really her own child with Robinson. And Robinson thought about marrying Marie. We don't know why, but he never did. And you might also wonder about the title of this painting, and it does seem odd, like Bachman. But you can see she's reading, or taking a pause and reading a yellow-backed novel. Presumably from the title, that means she's reading Émile Zola's novel, Le Debacle, which was his novel about the Franco-Prussian War from 1870-71. And it really was a debacle for the French. They were humiliatingly defeated by the Prussians. Now, here are some fun photographs. Robinson took this photograph himself, which means he must have had a camera with a tripod and a timer. And this is a photograph he took of Monet, and then later he used the photograph as the basis for a charcoal drawing of Monet. But one thing that I think is delightful about this photograph is that Robinson and his friend Kenyon Cox, another American artist, don't they look so arty? They look so self-consciously artistic in their smocks and their little beanie caps. And then look, here's Monet. He's wearing wooden sabots, and he's got this old shabby tweed coat on and a pullover sweater and this kind of odd little shapeless cloth hat. So I think that's really quite fun. How close were Monet and Robinson? And you might wonder, why am I showing you this? Well, there's a reason. Actually, they were probably pretty close. We know from Robinson's detailed diary that he kept in Giverny that he visited Monet at his home quite often. He would invite Monet to see him, to see what works he was working on, and he invited Monet, he invited Monet to critique his works, and Monet invited Robinson to do the same for his paintings. One of Robinson's best friends was an American artist named Theodore Butler. Butler married one of Monet's stepdaughters, Suzanne, and then in 1892, one summer, when Robinson was in Giverny, Monet married a second time to a woman he'd been living with for a number of years, Alice Houchet. And the evening of the wedding, there was a celebratory dinner, and Robinson was one of the guests at the dinner, along with fellow artist Gustav Caillebotte, who painted this, well-known and beloved painting, The Rainy Day. And another guest at the painting was Paul Helou, who's not that well known today. He was a French artist, probably best known in America as a good friend of John Singer Sargent, who painted this picture of Helou out sketching en plein air. And Sargent himself was a very good friend of Monet, and himself went to Giverny sometimes to paint in the open air. So these artists, they all know one another. They're all good buddies. We also know that Robinson and Monet corresponded when Robinson was back in the USA. Now, one thing is quite clear, that one of Monet's biggest influences on Robinson was Robinson starting to paint series paintings, which are paintings where you're looking at the same locale, painting the same locale, but in different times of day, or different atmospheric conditions, or even different seasons. And Monet was famous for doing plein air series paintings like this, his series of haystacks, and these are haystacks in the fields of Giverny, or his marvelous series of the facade of Rouen Cathedral in different times of day. So Robinson started painting series paintings. And as I mentioned, he kept a diary, which not only discusses his personal thoughts, but he writes a lot about his work in it. And on June 4th, 1892, he noted that he had just started painting 2 canvases of a view from the hills of Giverny down to the River Seine and then the village of Vernon beyond. So here's Vernon, here's the river, and here's the look down from the hills. One of the paintings, he said, was painted in conditions of bright sunlight. So that's this one, which was in the Corcoran Gallery of Art. Of course, sadly, the Corcoran is no more. And now this painting belongs to the National Gallery in Washington. But the second painting was done under more cloudy conditions. So that's this painting, the one that's in the Addison Gallery. And if you look closely, you can see differences. For one thing, in the Addison, there are a lot more clouds in the sky. There are a lot more shadows, and in this case, the shadows are darker colored. Here they're bluey, here they're more kind of purpley browny. And you can see other differences too, like the blue here, and here we're not seeing that blue. Well, a few days later, Robinson noted in his diary that he had begun a third painting in the series, and that this was on an overcast day. And he noted in his diary that it was a gray day, beautiful and still. And that's the Maier's painting. And here, you can see them all together. And so you can see that indeed, the Maier painting is a lot more sort of pinky and gray tone than these two are. So sunny, partly sunny, and cloudy. But really, these are beautiful works. Robinson considered them the best series that he ever did. And Monet also praised this particular group of paintings by Robinson very much. Now, Robinson did more series paintings in Giverny that year, but sadly 1892 was the last year he spent in Giverny. Finances and poor health took him back to the United States, and he was never able to go back to Europe again. Back in the US, he exhibited his Giverny paintings, and they were well reviewed by critics, and there was interest in them, but they didn't sell. So he had to go back to teaching to help support himself, and he taught open-air summer painting classes in the summers of 1893, 94, and 95. He did this for a number of different schools, and one of the summers in 1893, he was teaching in Ulster County, New York, and that part of New York State is very close to the borders with Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and there was a big canal system there. And so Robinson did a whole series of paintings of the canal series, and here I'm just showing them two of them. So you can see that he's now applying his Impressionist plein air method to American scenes. He also painted plein air landscapes in his native Vermont, and he joined his fellow Impressionists and plein air painters and good friends, J. Alden Weir, John Flockman, and Child Hassam, in painting summer scenery in Coscob, Connecticut. But sadly, Robinson then died of his asthma in April of 1896. Now, this is a work by John Twachtman, a good friend of Robinson, a dedicated painter of landscapes. Twachtman basically spent his entire career as a mature artist painting landscapes on plein air. And many of his best works are landscapes of Connecticut scenery, where Twachtman would paint scenes around his farm, which was in Greenwich, and he also painted a lot of scenes in Coscob, which is a riverside area that's technically part of Greenwich. Twachtman also taught open-air painting classes in the summers in Coscob, Connecticut, and in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And so through his own art and through his teaching, he also helped establish plein air painting and Impressionism in the United States. Now, Twachtman studied art at the Royal Academy in Munich and in Paris, and when he was in France, he absorbed three very big influences, and these were the art of Whistler, the art of the Impressionists, and Japanese art. And it was in France that he began painting on plein air. And when he got back to America, Twachtman was teaching art in New York City, and he was first based in the city, but once he could afford it, he wanted to buy a farm in the countryside. So he bought a farm and surrounding 17 acres on a place called Round Hill Road in Greenwich, and so he called the farm Round Hill Farm. Now at that time, Greenwich really had an unspoiled rural character, and yet it was only a short train ride from New York City, and there were trains going back and forth between New York and Greenwich about 20 times a day. So it was great for commuters. So Twachtman could live and do his own painting on the farm and yet easily get to the city to continue his teaching. And Greenwich and Coscob in particular were very popular places for summer vacationers, and they still are. And well-to-do New Yorkers would buy vacation homes, weekend homes and summer homes out in this area. There were also artists' colonies there. So Twachtman began painting plein air landscapes of his own property. And while you can't really call him a serial painter, and that's someone who did serial imagery like Monet and Robinson do, nonetheless, he tends to paint some of the same scenes over and over again on his property. And an area that he painted many times was a pool surrounded by hemlock trees. So he called it the hemlock pool. And here we see paintings that Twachtman did of this pool in the wintertime. And he was actually very interested in the challenge of painting on plein air in winter and the challenge of doing all these white tones in a painting. And Twachtman, by the way, was a really die-hard plein air artist. He painted outdoors in all seasons and in all weathers, just like Claude Monet did, actually. So we know that he actually went out in the snow to paint these works, so he wasn't just looking out a window or something like that. But in a number of Twachtman's paintings of the Connecticut scene, like these two, his style is really kind of a mix of those influences of Whistler, Impressionism, and Japanese art. And his art always has a very strong sense of design. And you can see here, these paintings are very flat, decorative. This one in particular is really quite abstracted looking. Now, another scene on his property that Twachtman painted many times was a brook called Horseman Brook. And it was quite picturesque. Twachtman had a white bridge built over the brook, as you see here. And in some of these Connecticut works, like these, you see that Twachtman is really painting in flat-out Impressionist mode. He's imbuing his canvas with light and atmosphere. He's using this sort of broken Impressionist brush stroke, with each stroke being a building block of color. And then back to the Maier's painting. So this is a picture of Twachtman and his family on the porch on his farmhouse. And then here's the painting again in the detail. This was probably painted of the garden at Twachtman's farmhouse. And you can see again, it's full-blown Impressionist style. This is really a gorgeous painting, and go look at it later. It's really stunningly beautiful, as so many plein air Impressionist works are. And you can see in this work that even the shadows are colored. They're very purpley. So you see his mastery of the style. And it's interesting, too, in that a lot of Twachtman's later landscapes, like this one from 1898, and you see he died in 1902, like his friend Theodore Robinson. He didn't live very long. But a lot of his later landscapes are really of the more cultivated areas around the house, rather than the more semi-wild areas of the Hemlock Pool and the brook. Now, this is the Maier's Child Hassan painting, early evening after snowfall. Hassan was one of the most successful American artists working in the Impressionist style, and he was also devoted to plein air painting. Hassan was from Boston. He received his first artistic training in America, and then he worked for a while for a design firm doing textiles and wallpaper, and he also made money from book illustrations. But he starts exhibiting work early on. From earliest days, he's very interested in portraying the urban scene. As you see here in this early work, painted of Columbus Avenue in Boston, we see the city in the rain with the slick pavement. You can see he's dedicated to painting modern life, urban life. But yet, at this point, he's not using a color palette that we think of as being associated with Impressionism. But he decides, even though he is very successful in getting more and more established, that he wants more artistic training. So in 1886, he goes to Paris. He's 27 years old, and he knew about Impressionist painting. He'd already seen examples of it in the United States, but it doesn't really seem to catch on with him until he's in Paris. And then he starts painting works like this, really as an Impressionist plein air artist. This work, Grand Prix Day, shows the parade of people in their wonderful carriages going off for a day at the races. And you can see that his palette has considerably lightened up in the last 2 years, and he's using broken Impressionist brushstroke, and there's a lot of interest here in light and atmosphere. So he stays in Paris for 3 years. He comes back to America, settles in New York City, because by that time, really, New York is now the cultural capital. It's superseded Boston in that role. And he works in the Impressionist style for the rest of his life, and many of his works are painted plein air. And here's a photograph of Hassan painting on plein air. Well, technically on a porch, but he's outside. And this is on the porch of the cottage of a very dear friend of his, and really a woman who was rather a mentor to him, Celia Baxter. Baxter lived on the Isle of Shoals, and many of Hassam's freshest, most light-filled plein air paintings depict the area of the Isle of Shoals, particularly Appledore Island. That's where Baxter lived. And the Isle of Shoals was a very popular tourist destination in the summertime in the late 19th century. Hassam started painting there in the mid-1880s and continued to be inspired by the Isle of Shoals until around 1916. You can see in these works he's using a very bright, light-filled palette. Now his friend Celia Baxter was a poet and a journalist. Her home on Appledore Island was a cultural oasis. She filled it with her friends who were writers and artists and musicians. Her garden was very famous. It was very unstructured in style, and it looked out to the water. And many of Baxter's own poems were inspired by her garden. And she and Hassam collaborated on some of her poetry books. He would produce watercolor paintings of the garden, which were then reproduced to illustrate the poems in her book through the method of colored engravings. Now, Baxter also encouraged Hassam to slightly change his name. His first name was actually Frederick. That was his father's name. And Child was his middle name. But Baxter thought Child was a much more interesting name, and she encouraged him to start signing his paintings that way. And so he did. And if you look very carefully, it has some signature. And if you go out and look at early evening snowfall, you see the same thing. He would put a little crescent mark. So here's the signature. Right there, there's the crescent mark. He would put a little crescent mark right next to his signature. Sometimes it's so abstracted it almost looks like a little slash or a hook, but it is meant to be a crescent. Why did he do that? Well, in part it might have been in tribute to Celia Baxter. And you can just barely make it out. Well, you can in the real painting. In the slide, it's a little difficult. But she always wore a crescent moon ornament in her hair. And so Hassam may have adopted the crescent as part of his signature as a tribute to her. But it may also have been a play on his name, which was pronounced Hassam. But strangers who didn't know him often mispronounced his name as Hassam. And some people seeing the name thought that perhaps he was of Middle Eastern ethnicity. He wasn't, and he was actually descended from early English settlers of New England. But that was really a joke, a good joke among Hassam and his friends about how he was really Middle Eastern. So that might have been part of the crescent moon thing. But Celia Baxter passed away in 1894, and while Hassam continued to visit the Isle of Shoals, after her death, he stopped painting scenes of her garden and instead is inspired by the water and the rocks of the island. So most of his scenes from the Isle of Shoals from about 1899 on are seascapes. As you see here, again, they're very impressionistic. You see the broken brushstroke. This painting in particular might be hard to make out from the slide, but it's really very tactile in terms of the layering on of paint to indicate the chalky surf and the foam. But he wasn't only painting on plein air in the countryside. He was still painting the urban scene, only now he's showing the New York scene. Some of his paintings of New York, like this, really give us a bird's eye view. And these works were typically painted from balconies of what were then the high-rise buildings in New York. Some of the works show us the city at street level. And another difference about his New York works, as opposed to his earlier works of the urban scene done in Boston and Paris, is that the later works, the New York works, really tend to be a lot less formal in composition, and they have much looser brushwork, particularly the works that are done after the turn of the new century, like the Maier's work, Early Evening After Snowfall. And Hassam painted a number of snow scenes of the city, but unlike his friend Bachman, he actually didn't paint these on plein air. But he did write to a friend in reference to another snow scene of a New York street that he went out and sketched quickly and noted in his sketchbook the colors, the conditions of the sky, and the reflections of light. And you can see here he's very interested both in the winter light of the sky, in the snow piled up, which looks almost purpley, and he's very interested, of course, in the lights. Here we see the artificial lights in the shop windows. We see the street lights, even the lights on the cabs. Now, of course, by this time, New York City had streetcars, but there were still horse-drawn cabs. And while you might guess that these are gas lights, and they may be, I actually don't know for sure, but some of New York's streets had been electrified as early as 1884, so these might actually be electric lights. But in any case, Hassan was really fascinated by the play of light against the snow and the twilight hour. You can almost imagine how quiet the snow is making the city. Some of Hassan's best-known later paintings of the urban scene are a series of works he did between 1916 and 1918 during World War I, when Fifth Avenue was decorated with American flags and the flags of its allies. And you can see here that these are really very colorful, boldly designed paintings. There's a lot of interest in the abstract shapes of the flags themselves. So these bold colors and decorative patterns were really inspiring to him. And the focus here is really on the decorative effect, much more than it is on people in the street or on the buildings themselves. And ever faithful to his interest in plein air painting and Impressionism, he probably painted these scenes from the balcony. Now there is an irony to this. Hassan had become an Impressionist and a plein air painter because he wanted to be part of the vanguard of American art. He wanted to be a leader in the avant-garde. And yet, by the time the First World War broke out, modernism had moved far beyond Impressionism, and painting on plein air was no longer considered to be radical. By then, it was very well accepted and popular method employed by amateur and professional artists alike. And of course, this is often a typical progression, not only in art, but in most aspects of life. The innovators eventually become the establishment. And the shock of the new with time becomes the comfort of the familiar. And today, though, the paintings of the later 19th century American artists who helped pioneer and establish plein air painting are among the most beloved and admired works in all American art. And we are very fortunate to have such stellar examples of their art in the Maier's collection. So, thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
I'm happy to have them. Or if you want to go eat, you could ask me things later.
And the reception is actually in Gallery 2, where you're going to be surrounded by all of the paintings that Kathleen discussed in this lecture. So that's very exciting. Thank you so much, Kathleen.
Oh, you're welcome.